The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from, and welcome to our September webinar, Pedestrians Are People Too, the Criminalization of Walking. And my slides don't want to work. So try it this way. Sorry about that. My name is Heidi Simon. I'm the Deputy Director here at America Walks. I'm here with my colleague, Kelsey Card. We will be facilitating this webinar for you and bringing you the conversation, which we were so excited to have about some of the issues around walking and some of the obstacles and barriers to creating a culture of walking physical activity in places in the US. That's very odd. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors for this program and for all of our programming at America Walks. And I apologize, I will work out my own technical difficulties once we get the exciting part of today started. But I do want to just make note of the people you see here on the screen, as well as all of the people who support our programs. We do want to make this as interactive as possible today. If you have a question or a technical issue, please enter it in your GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. We will get to as many of the questions as possible at the end of the hour. Any questions that we do not get to at the end of the hour, we will do our best to get answers to you and follow up by email after the broadcast. One question I know we are going to get, and I will share it with you now, is yes, this is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording as well as any of the related resources and other materials that we are able to provide to you in a link in that follow-up email, and it'll be on our homepage as well at americawalks.org. I'm very excited to bring this webinar to everybody today. We have a great panel talking about some very important issues. Angie Schmidt, who's the editor of Streets Blog USA. If you're not familiar with their work, I encourage you to check it out. We'll be talking about the role that media and communications and how we talk about pedestrians and pedestrian fatalities have an impact on our work. Andrew Silber, who's with the University City District, will be talking about creating places and justice within places. And we have brought back Topher Sanders. You might remember he was a speaker on one of our Walking Towards Justice episodes. And I'm going to hand it over to him now so that we can get rid of my technical difficulties and hear from him on the important work and research he's done related to jaywalking and the disparities within jaywalking and enforcement. So Topher, take it away.
Hello, thank you for having me again, and thank you for everyone who's attending this webinar. I'll jump right into it. Myself and a friend and colleague at the Florida Times Union did about 8 to 9 months worth of work and research on a series of articles looking at pedestrian enforcement in Florida, specifically the Jacksonville area, metro area of Florida, and so that's what this presentation will be about. And so that was done by, again, ProPublica and the Florida Times Union, and the series called Walking While Black. Let's see. Okay, great. So in Florida, there are some 28 or so different pedestrian infractions one can find themselves violating. Everything from, you know, walking on the wrong side of the road, failing to cross the road at a right angle. So if you cross the road at any kind of, acuter angle than 90 degrees, then that would be a violation. There's statutes against walking canes, or excuse me, canes for the blind, and how those are used in the state of Florida. And we did find people throughout the state being cited for that. So there's a lot of different infractions someone can commit in the state of Florida that will give them a pedestrian infraction. So particularly in Jacksonville, who's getting ticketed. So I think I should back up. The reason we got into all of this was because of a viral video of a young man who had been cited with a walking infraction. I think it was like walking against red hand, kind of classic jaywalking. And he proceeded to kind of challenge the officer, and he recorded it. And the officer's energy and was so excited about this pedestrian stop, and he had such an aggressive energy around it. And in one of the exchanges, he told the young black man, "Do you have your ID?" And Devonte says no, and he says, "Well, again, that's another infraction. In the state of Florida, you must have ID in order to walk around." And I saw that, instantly knew that that was incorrect. And also, I saw the casualness by which the officer said it, and that there were two other officers there, and nobody corrected anyone. And indeed, it was wrong. It was a ticket they had to drop, because they only can give you that ticket if you're behind the wheel of a motor vehicle. But it led me to wonder, and it led my colleague Ben to wonder, how often do they do this? What does the broader breadth of pedestrian infractions or pedestrian enforcement look like? Well, this gives you an indication of what it looks like. Duval County, 61% white, 29% black, and almost the exact opposite when it relates to who's getting tickets. So when you look at who's getting tickets, it's the bottom ticket there. You see 55% of all pedestrian tickets in the 5-year span that we examined went to black folks, 42 went to white folks. And if you look at JSO, which is Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, that is the specific agency that gives the biggest share of the tickets, and you see their numbers there. What they told us initially was the reason we give tickets is because we're trying to prevent pedestrian deaths. So we wanted to examine pedestrian deaths in the 5-year period. This is what we found, that there were 194 pedestrian deaths in that 5-year period. 62% of those who died were white, significantly older as well. They were white and older, and only 30% of those who died were black, which is in line with the population. So another thing that we wanted to look at was, where are these tickets being given, and where are the people being hit by cars? And so what you'll see is that crashes, pedestrian fatal crashes, are occurring throughout the county, entire county. But the blacker a census tract was, the more tickets you saw being given there, which was just another way to analyze and show that it was not about pedestrian safety. It was really just a policing tactic. So then we wanted to see, well, they say they're doing it to protect people. What's the impact? Is it working? So in the time that they started to give all of these tickets out, they increased tickets by 40%. Fatal pedestrian crashes increased by virtually the same amount, 37%. So it didn't show that there'd be a positive impact with their enforcement tactic. This is another, this is a flyer. What you're seeing now is a flyer that the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office would routinely give in their awareness and education campaigns around pedestrian safety. And the reason we have this flyer up is because it is wrong. It is incorrect. If you'll look over here where it says, when walking, pedestrians always use crosswalks and sidewalks, blah, 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 then you'll see I have a pull down there at the bottom. It talks about this crossing in between intersections is called jaywalking. And it goes on to say that it's the most common violation, blah, 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 blah. Well, that is incorrect. Doesn't match with state law, doesn't match with state statute. And they were handing this out for years and years and years. And it was another indication that the police that were out there ticketing people did not understand the law, and their leadership did not understand the law, and it was impacting pedestrians, largely Black and poor pedestrians throughout Jacksonville. So this is kind of what that flyer is speaking to. Get a little in the weeds here, but I was told that's kind of what we do on these webinars, so I'll do that. There was one ticket that we found that they were giving out erroneously like candy, and it was a ticket for walking outside the crosswalk. In the state of Florida, for whatever reason, it is illegal to walk outside the crosswalk where you are in between two adjacent intersections that both have traffic lights. So if you look at this, the figure B here, B, where you see these intersections are both have traffic lights to the left and right. If you were to walk outside the crosswalk there, meaning a mid-block crossing, you would be in violation of state law. But in figure A, if you walk outside the crosswalk there, you are not in violation of state law. What we found were hundreds and hundreds of tickets given to people who crossed in a similar fashion as you see in figure A. They were not violating state law, yet they were given a ticket anyway. Okay. And here's just a breakdown of that, where you see the ticket numbers. So in Duval, 54% of the time they issued that ticket, it was wrong. And when we looked across the state at some of the biggest counties and municipalities in the state, we found 61% of the time officers in the state of Florida gave this ticket, it was incorrect. And in the time period we examined, that comes to about 3,500 tickets, mostly to Black pedestrians throughout the state of Florida. So, you know, it doesn't increase safety. And when a lot of people will say, oh, well, they do this to generate money. Well, not really, because most people don't pay the tickets. And so when we looked in, particularly in Duval, it only generated about 70 grand over the 5 years. So that's by no means a windfall for a community the size of Duval. So then it just leads you to the other questions about why they would do it, and it leads you down the route of looking at broken windows and policing. And this is what this is about, just about broken windows being the heavy enforcement of low-level infractions, citations, and crimes in order to you know, kind of control and sorry, kind of control and have an impact on severe crimes. And it's a theory called broken windows. I'll run through these really, really quickly. This is just a breakdown of some of the people we encountered as we did this reporting. This is a 13-year-old who got one of these tickets from walking across the street from her school. She happened to encounter a detective who detective said she had to stand on her brakes in order not to hit Brianna as she walked across the street. And the detective then gets out of her car and wants to talk to Brianna. And Brianna did not want to talk to the detective and would not speak to the detective and began to walk away from the detective. And the detective handcuffed her, arrested her, and took her downtown. Her mother did show up on the scene and said, hey, listen, if you're going to say my daughter violated this pedestrian statute, cool. Give me the ticket. I'll take my daughter. We'll go home. The detective said, no, I'm writing your daughter if she's going downtown. And I think they wanted to charge her with some other stuff, but they ended up dropping that stuff. But the mom had to sit downtown Jacksonville for about 6-7 hours waiting to process Brianna out. And, you know, if you're 13, this being one of your early interactions with the police, that probably begins to shape how you see the police in some ways. Oh, and by the way, she was given the wrong ticket. If she was going to be given a citation, there may have been a pedestrian citation that she was warranted, but she gave her the walking outside the crosswalk citation, which in that particular area, Brianna could not have violated, and thus it was a bad ticket. Devonte Shipman's the young man who kind of started all of this. He's the gentleman in the viral video who challenged the officer and what the officer was saying to him as to relates to his ticket. Noemi Martinez, she was trying to get herself a new job and was hustling back and forth between bus stops. And in doing that, she wanted to walk around a massive puddle and a broken piece of sidewalk. And, you know, if you know anything about pedestrian walkways in the poorest parts of the community, the sidewalks are in the most disrepair. And this is one of those areas, and it was also flooded with water. So she started to walk around that. And when she walked into the street, a cop saw her, started to, you know, give her instructions. Brianna wasn't clear on what he was saying. There was some back and forth. She ended up getting a ticket. Now this is just to give you a sense that in some parts of Jacksonville, to your right, what you're seeing is a very well-established part of Jacksonville called San Marco. Lots of roundabouts, tons of crosswalks, lots of signage, more technical technology and infrastructure at each intersection. And then to your left, what you see is one of the roadways in Jacksonville where they were having a pedestrian issue, and their solution was, instead of slowing down traffic, putting in crosswalks, was to build that fence that you see right in the middle. So now they still have a pedestrian issue where occasionally people get struck, injured, and killed, but people are still doing what would be natural to them to try to get to the quickie mark across the street. Instead, now they just have to jump a fence to get there. We also found that, of course, this is not just a ticket you get that is just for $65 up to $80, depending on where you are in Florida, but also you can get your license suspended for this walking infraction in the state of Florida. And we found that about half of the people who get ticketed for a pedestrian issue in Jacksonville ultimately saw their license and privilege to drive suspended. This is just another person who got a ticket. JSO's initial response to us was, well, clearly Black people jaywalk more, or Black people don't follow the pedestrian statutes as well. And initially that evolved over time to say to us that it was about safety, and also JSO ultimately started putting out their own numbers and statistics about this dynamic, which I think I'll get to later. This is just to show that there was some calls to action. There was some reaction from the community. Council members became involved. Local civil rights groups became involved. And the NAACP Legal Defense Fund did take a trip to Jacksonville to start doing early fact finding for, whatever it is they could potentially do, which could ultimately be some type of legal action. There's no commitment to do that, but they are looking into the issue. This is what I wanted to highlight here in the red. So months after our reporting, the sheriff released a data set that he claimed to be the real data, and it included a pedestrian panhandling charge that was not part of our analysis, is in no way really similar to a pedestrian issues that we examined, and it was really given to large shares of white homeless folks in Jacksonville. And that took the numbers of the share going to Black folks way down. And he started sharing that across the community, particularly to the Black civil rights groups, to say, oh no, it's not that bad. We only gave 30-something% of tickets to Black folks, more in line with the population. When we dug into his data, we showed that there was stuff there that shouldn't have been included. Okay, so today, not much has changed in Jacksonville. Again, in that 5-year period, they gave out 353 bad crosswalk tickets. 132 people lost their driver's license because of those. And this is just in 5 years. The statutes that led to this have been on the books since the 70s. So who knows how long they've been, enforcing this incorrectly. I will say the sheriff's office did go to the state attorney's office after we ran this and asked them for an interpretation of the law. They got the same interpretation that we provided them, and they've since done some training to try to improve the way those tickets are given out. And they also dismissed just a handful of tickets we found that shouldn't have been given to walkers that were intended for motorists. So I tried to do that soon, as quick and as fast as possible. So I'm done.
Great, thank you, Topher. And these injustices, I'm sure, are happening in other communities across the country. We've heard stories of them. I think highlighting this just brings to the fact that we need more attention drawn to issues like this and more conversations like this, because at the end of the day, it really just discourages people from walking and distracts from the issues that need to be solved to create safe and accessible communities. So we're going to go from streets to places and hand it over to Andrew, who is looking at justice within places in his work and some really fascinating things that he's doing. So Andrew, take it away.
Thanks. Is my screen showing? Yes, hold on one second. Great. So just two quick responses to Topher's great presentation. One, That's exactly why everyone on this phone call should be subscribed to their local newspaper so they can support journalism like this, because important journalism like that doesn't happen for free. So subscribe to your local paper. And I think there'll be an important connection between these two presentations, and I think both of them will hopefully help illuminate some of the structural racism that people of color are facing all over this country in our public spaces in ways that are not always transparent. So here at University City District, which is a special services district in West Philadelphia, we have launched a project called Just Spaces. I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. Just very quickly, University City District is a 20-year-old special services district. We operate a lot like a business improvement district. We started out 20 years ago with clean and safe work in the neighborhood, security ambassadors, community cleaners. We have a wide range of programs that we run on the event side and promoting our commercial corridors. We have a great workforce development program as well, and run a variety of transportation programs. But something that we've been quite focused on in the last 8 years or so is our work in public spaces, and it's one of the areas that I oversee here at University City District. This is a map of the area. It's about 2.5 square miles of West Philadelphia. About 55,000 people live in this area, and 75,000 people come to work every day here. On the right side of your screen, where that number 1 is, that's just outside of 30th Street Station. If you've arrived at Philadelphia by Amtrak, you've come into 30th Street Station. And then as you move to the left, you move through the campuses of Drexel University and University of Pennsylvania and into residential neighborhoods in the district. And so those residential neighborhoods range from high income to low income, from high concentrations of students to high concentrations of families and young professionals and longtime residents. Our work in placemaking has focused on projects big and small. So you see what the area outside of 30th Street Station looked like just about 8 years ago, and what it looks like today. We transformed those lanes of parking into a very well-used public plaza called the Porch at 30th Street Station that has all sorts of wonderful features and programming, but the swings are a very popular part of the Porch at 30th Street Station. And then we've transformed all sorts of community spaces around the district. So vacant lots into community composting centers, parking spaces into parklets, and underused traffic triangles into community amenities. We've collected a lot of data on our spaces. It was one of the things I was most impressed about when I first arrived at University City District, was just the incredible amount of data they had on the use of their public spaces. But there was a really important question that the data couldn't answer, and that was who's not in this public space and why aren't they here? And something, as someone with a background in transportation but relatively new to sort of public space work, stood out to me that there was a strong and understandable bias in public space work towards the user, and not asking questions about who's not using their spaces. And so we wanted to start answering that question, and it had us asking lots of other questions, including how could we measure the social justice impacts of our public space, and what's a framework to understand that. There's a lot of talk in Philadelphia and around the country, but particularly in Philadelphia, about equity in public space. And that talk ranged from lip service to very sincere. But I felt like, and lots of others, as I would talk to them, felt like no one really knew what they were talking about. It could go off in lots of different directions when you talked about equity in public space. And so we went searching for a framework to help guide these conversations and help develop a help us think about a way we could analyze these. And we ended up with a framework developed by Professor Seth Lowe at the CUNY Graduate Center that really focused on justice. So if you've ever gone to a planning conference in the last 10 years, you've seen this slide. Equality is everybody gets the same thing. Equity is everybody is able to access the same resource by getting perhaps different levels of support. We want to just change the whole model and go to justice. Let's just tear down the fence. And so this framework of justice centers around three specific domains of justice. The first is distributive justice. And this is sort of who has physical proximity to space assets. And you can think about that physical proximity in lots of different ways. Who can walk to a public space asset? Who can ride transit, or who can drive there? But it's really about who has physical access to it. And there's actually quite a bit of work in this area, particularly in the parks world, around doing GIS analysis of who has access, but thinking about on a network basis where assets are distributed. And the next is procedural justice. So who's listened to and how are they listened to in the planning, design, and operations of a public space? And it's and the design and the operations piece of this is a very important part to highlight, because we've gotten pretty good and thought a lot about public engagement when it comes to planning and design, but that often falls away when it comes to operations and maintenance of public space. And also thinking about what does this mean for different kinds of public spaces. So sort of a charismatic public space in the center of a city is going to have a different set of expectations from the public on how they want to be listened to and engaged with than a neighborhood park might. And the last, and in some ways the most important and connected to this conversation, is interactional justice. So what makes people feel welcome or unwanted in a public space? And this is, very much the conversation, a piece of the conversation that was being had about statues in public spaces. So the statue in the center there is Frank Rizzo, who has was a mayor of Philadelphia and a police commissioner of Philadelphia, and is seen very differently by different Philadelphians in terms of the impact that he had on the city and their personal and family experiences with him. So statues and what kind of symbols you have in public spaces can make people feel welcome or unwanted in a public space. What kind of food and beverage is being offered? What kind of security and public safety services and how those officers interact with the public can very much shape a person's experience of feeling welcome or unwanted in a public space. What kind of programming you have in your public space and the design of your public space can all impact how people feel welcome or unwanted. And so this is broadly speaking, the framework of justice, looking at these three areas: distributional, procedural, and interactional. And then further into interactional, we look at two finer points, being an ethic of care. So how do people show that they care for each other and the space itself, and also as an indicator of interactional justice, and then also representation. Do people feel that they see themselves and their history and their experience represented in public space? And just quickly on why this matters and why we're doing this work, we think we have a moral imperative to do this work. We like to think of ourselves as the Holy Father in this situation. It means having uncomfortable conversations, but important conversations about how do we assess and measure what we're doing and how do we do it better. It's an organizational opportunity for us. It's opened new doors and introduced us to new partners and new funding opportunities by having these conversations. And finally, I think there's an important professional obligation for those of us who are making our careers in infrastructure, making our careers in transportation and public space. We come from a legacy that is not entirely a proud one, as I'm sure the people on this phone call know, in terms of the history of creating infrastructure in public spaces and how that's impacted low-income communities and communities of color. And hopefully we can develop a different history for our generation. We created an advisor group to help advise our work, which included a high school student, included some academics from Penn and Rutgers, included a variety of community leaders with very diverse backgrounds in Philadelphia, none of whom make their careers in public space. Some folks who are responsible for planning and designing public space. So a landscape architect, the head of ACOM's landscape architecture in the Americas, deputy commissioner for capital planning for the Parks Department, and the former head of facilities for the city. Two of the principals in our neighborhood, one is the principal of the school for children with cerebral palsy, the other principal of our local elementary school, a former deputy police commissioner, a technologist, a journalist, Malcolm Burnley, who many of you may read in Next City and other publications, an artist who works in our community, and a developer and marketer. And so these are all people with the exception of the academics and some of the planners, don't focus every day on public space. But one of the things that's so powerful is how public space and people interact with it is part of pretty much everyone's lives and touches tangentially on lots of different aspects of work. So up in the upper right-hand corner, you see Takia McClinton. She is a founder of a group in Philadelphia called City Fit Girls, and she's the manager of one of the big running stores in Philadelphia, but she also ran the Clark Park Farmers Market for 2 years. She thinks a lot about public space, but not as a planner or operator of it. Deputy Commissioner Bethel, who ran patrol for the city of Philadelphia Police Department for many years and came up through the ranks, spent a lot of time thinking about public safety and negotiating demands, the varying demands and conflicting demands for what public safety meant in public spaces. And the school principals spend a lot of time tangentially thinking about public space and how their kids move through it, and everyone has an opinion. So one of the things that we've done in this work is also sponsored and paid for focus groups, real market grade, academic grade research here, not public meetings where we get together the usual suspects, not going out to the advocacy groups that can kind of gather all the same people who offer their opinions all the time, but working with a group at the Temple Institute for Survey Research at Temple University that run a program called Be Heard Philly, where we paid Philadelphians who live in this neighborhood to tell us about their experiences in public spaces, and we divided those groups up into African American residents and white residents in the neighborhood, and they unanimously agreed that Clark Park, which is a large regional park in this neighborhood, was their favorite public space in the neighborhood, and everyone across age and race in these groups were diverse and internally in terms of age and gender identification and income. They all identified Clark Park as their favorite public space. And here are two quotes from some Caucasian women, and they were very consistent with other quotes that we heard. And if you talk as you read the quotes, I'll just mention that if you talk to public space, those who are engaged in public space in Philadelphia, they will say, Clark Park is kind of a pinnacle of public space. It is one of the most diverse places, the diverse sets of users that you will see in a public space in the city. When we talked to African American users, they told us very similar things about how they love the public spaces. When we asked the Caucasian users, could you come up with negative experiences in the public spaces in Clark Park? It was a real struggle for them. However, it was not at all a struggle for our African American respondents. I'm going to share some of these quotes. Move through them a little bit slowly here. And so while your surface data collection efforts may tell you, and even your intercept surveys may tell you, wow, you have incredibly diverse use of this public space, and this is kind of meeting all of what we would think our goals want to be, just beneath the surface, different people are having very different experiences of the exact same space. And that's true on sidewalks, which are just as much public spaces as parks. Just a little bit on what we are, what we're doing in this project. So we're sharing perspectives on justice and public space by listening to a different set of voices than is usually engaged in public space discussions. We're trying to create some clearer ways of thinking about justice in public space and foster a community of practice here in Philadelphia around this. We're working on and just received responses to an RFP that we put out for an audit tool for public space owners and managers. We're going to be evaluating our own work here at University City District and develop interventions to make our places more just. We've started in some very small ways to take some early actions on this front. We put our first parklet in front of a non-food and beverage establishment, and so we put it in front of a laundromat in the neighborhood. And this was actually a photo that was taken literally moments after it was installed. People immediately came out to use it from the laundromat. We're putting up worked with a community group to put up some historic signage to highlight the history of various minority groups in the neighborhood in Palatine Village. We worked with another nonprofit that owned a large vacant lot to help transform that lot, which is also a very busy bus stop, into a more hospitable place. So I just want to leave you with the big questions that we find ourselves grappling with when it comes to public space and have emerged in our conversations with the advisory group and others. These are not questions we have answers to. And I think the first one is the one that we keep coming back to because it's a really important one, and it's one that is particularly true in communities that are experiencing any kind of change in their neighborhood, and particularly they're facing challenges from gentrification. So sometimes public space is a reflection of societal structures of inequality, racism, sexism, and ableism, and sometimes it's a refuge from these structures. Who decides if it's a reflection or a refuge, and if to intervene and how to intervene? Is a park better if it's seen as having a perceived owner, or is it better if it's seen as being owned by everybody or nobody? What are the best ways to collect data and ensure that it's actionable information? And lastly, and this is an important one too, there are a lot of neighborhood and park users who are looking for a way to become more engaged. And how can that community energy be harnessed without using that energy for excluding others? So that's where I'll leave you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. And so we see, as we turn our attention to places that it's not just policies and legislation and law enforcement that might be creating some of this hostility or aggression towards walking and people being in spaces, but also the perceptions or the built environment as well. We're going to shift gears a little bit. One of the things that we've seen increasingly and discouragingly at America Walks, and something we're tackling almost on a weekly basis, is that of victim blaming, and how people who walk and pedestrian fatalities and traffic fatalities are covered by the media and just communications in general. So who better than to bring on talk about this than a journalist and talk about what she's seeing. So I'm gonna hand it over to Angie and to dive into that topic a little bit.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens sort of when the worst thing happens when pedestrians are hit or killed, and how the marginalization of pedestrians in general has sort of led to a weird dynamic where we don't see much of an institutional response. Okay, so I want to go back and talk a little bit about the history here on this issue, because I think that helps sort of explain how we got to where we are now. I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with the work of Peter Norton, but he's a historian at the University of Virginia, and he wrote a book called Fighting Traffic, where he looks at the early days of the automobile industry in the cities in the United States. So this is a picture of Dayton's Main Street in 1910, and it was market day. So the farmers would come in from the fields around in the outer areas, and they would set up shop right in the street. This is the days before cars. These are horse-drawn carriages, but you see there's streetcars. You see pedestrians are sort of have free roam of the street. They can go wherever. You see a couple women in the middle of the street, pretty relaxed. So all that obviously changed a lot once cars started coming on the scene in a big way in the 1910s and the 1920s and the 1930s. And he writes about that in his book from sort of a critical perspective. Here's another historic use of the streets, children playing in the street. There were all kinds of uses for streets as a public space prior to the introduction of automobiles that were considered legitimate and okay, and children playing in the streets was a major use. It was very common in cities all around the country, and we do see that sometimes still today. So when cars started arriving on the scene, the 20s especially, there was just massive bloodshed. All of a sudden, thousands of people were being killed, and primarily they were children. A lot of the children who had free roam of the streets prior to this, all of a sudden are getting killed. And there was a lot of backlash. So Peter Norton says, you know, our modern conception of this is that everyone immediately embraced cars and, you know, welcomed them, and we voluntarily reordered our whole lives sort of to accommodate them. But actually there was a pretty heated political struggle at this time in the 20s. And this shows some historic newspaper iconography, some cartoons that were used to sort of illustrate people's response. And they had a very different response sort of than we have today when a pedestrian is killed. But eventually the auto industry, they teamed up with auto clubs, auto dealers, some oil industry people, and they started a lobbying campaign. And the goal of the lobbying campaign was to sort of redefine what streets are for. So initially, when people started getting killed by the hundreds and thousands in cities, the blame was almost automatically placed with the driver because pedestrians were seen as rightful street users. And this was a real threat to these industries that were just getting started, these guys that wanted to sell cars. So in response, they came up with this idea of jaywalking. And at the time, the term jay in the parlance of the day was a very sort of negative, it was a slur, like sort of if you called someone a hillbilly today. So they came up with this idea of jaywalking, and they started distributing flyers like this in the 30s. Boy Scouts would distribute them at street corners. For example, they would hang signs. And it reframed sort of the problem, and it placed the onus sort of on pedestrians for their own safety rather than drivers. And this was a big victory for them, and obviously it was a very successful campaign, and it reframed what streets are for, and that impacts the way we see the problem today quite a bit. So now pedestrians have become sort of marginalized, and our space, legally speaking, is limited, and Topher was talking about this, very limited in our motions, in the way we can cross, and it affects our safety quite a bit. So fast forward decades and decades, we've redesigned a lot of our urban places to accommodate car use and to accommodate fast driving. And we also have more recently this trend of the suburbanization of poverty. And this shows a woman on Buford Highway in Atlanta, which is in a suburban area of Atlanta that has a lot of low-income residents. This is one of the most dangerous kind of streets anywhere because it has a mix of commercial sites that a lot of people may want to access on foot, and it also has a lot of housing, especially some lower and moderate income housing. So here we have a woman who's being put in this very dangerous situation. And if she's killed, what will be our societal response? This is where I think we've really, our whole cultural response to this is really sort of broken down. So I just want to talk a little bit about Buford Highway. I think a lot of cities in America have a street a lot like this, but this is just a really famous example. It's the most dangerous road in Georgia. It doesn't have sidewalks for a lot of it. And you see here, someone went around and recorded all the paths that pedestrians have worn into the ground because they're using this road so much, but still they don't have basic accommodations. And so I want to talk about a really famous case. Some of you probably don't remember this. I've been doing this forever, but in 2010, this was a really big case. A woman named Raquel Nelson was in this position, was put in this dangerous position. And she's trying to cross Buford Highway. She lives in an apartment building along the road from her bus stop. She has 3 children with her 3 young children. Anyway, she's crossing this big road. Her son, AJ Newman, breaks free of her hand and is struck by a drunk driver and killed. So obviously this is a very terrible story, but it really became an outrage in Georgia because while the person who killed AJ Newman, the driver, was on drugs, was charged with some sort of crime. I can't remember exactly. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail. The prosecutor in the county where she lived brought charges on Raquel Nelson for vehicular homicide because she was jaywalking when her son was killed. And it caused a lot of outrage. It got the attention of a lot of groups. The NAACP was involved, walking and biking advocacy groups. A lot of people, I think, really saw the injustice of blaming this woman whose son was killed for his injuries. And it turned out that the closest crosswalk was 3/4 of a mile. So she would have had to go, I mean, it was really too much to ask of a pedestrian to walk that far out of their way with 3 young children at the end of the day. The road just simply didn't accommodate her, but she ended up being blamed. Fortunately, after about 3 years struggle, she was finally cleared of those charges, but she was charged with some lesser offenses in that case. So that sort of gets to how we conceptualize this problem in the United States. We look at sort of the individual. There's sort of a reflexive tendency to blame the individual, and it goes back to the way this was conceptualized in the early part of the last century, and sort of specifically to put pedestrians sort of as the responsible party. But so I think a lot of, and I have a background as a reporter, and I think that there are some sort of news conventions that contribute to this problem. I'm just going to go back to the previous slide for a second. For example, a lot of news organizations, they're trying to report about every fatality, for example. When I worked at a newspaper in Ohio, we had a convention where we reported about every traffic fatality. But that was not a very sexy assignment for a reporter. It was something you would do late at night if you had the police beat, and you would write a few sentences about this person, and that was it. And there would be, I think a lot of reporters, they have this tendency to want to wrap things up in a neat little bow. So they say this person was jaywalking or wasn't in a crosswalk or whatever. And there's a tendency to sort of assign blame to the victim. But if you look at the issue more broadly, and Topher is, sort of a rock star in doing reporting that looks at the issue so systemically. That's sort of rare, but we are starting to see better reporting like that more and more. I just want to use this map as an example. This comes from a couple who evaluated traffic crashes in Rockford, Illinois. And they found that they're all occurring, or many of them are occurring on the same roads. We see over and over again, whatever the Buford Highway of Rockford, Illinois is, we're seeing a lot of the crashes are concentrated around that road. And these guys found that 40% of the traffic fatalities in Rockford were on just 3 roads. And I think if you look at any city in America, you'll find a similar pattern generally. There's certain hot spots. It's not these pedestrian fatalities, traffic fatalities aren't a random occurrence. They're happening in a pattern that is spatial, and it has to do with design. So here's a case I want to talk about just as an example of the sort of bad reporting we see. And I don't think that the reporters are being malicious. I just think that they have the same sort of cultural biases that we all do, that go back to the way this has been framed in our society for a long time, and they're not questioning it, and they're not being critical enough. So this is a guy named Arnulfo Salazar. He was killed in June in Charlotte, and he was hit while walking by a off-duty police officer in a marked police vehicle. So there was 3 different news reports about this case, and this is a case that would attract more attention than usual because he was hit by a police officer. But this guy was 80 years old, and they all reported that he was not in a crosswalk, okay, that he was not wearing reflective clothing, but his daughter pointed out he was hit at 6 p.m. It was broad daylight, so there's no reason for him to wear reflective clothing. And furthermore, there's no legal requirement for pedestrians to wear reflective clothing, so it's sort of immaterial. And that's really a detail that I think is inappropriate for the press to bring up. It happens too much, and it's sort of a blaming the victim thing. And finally, these three different publications report that he ran in front of a cruiser. So he ran into the path. We see this a lot. It's sort of, you hear about all the time a pedestrian darting right in front of the car. And this is another sort of blaming framing. And I thought it was striking in this case that none of the publications, none of them asked, you know, why? Why would this guy, his family says he's in great shape. There's a picture on the right hand. His family was devastated from their GoFundMe page. Why would was he suicidal? Was he not of sound mind? Why would he run right in front of the cruiser? It just doesn't, plus he's 80 years old. So it's a little unusual to see 80-year-old people out running around in traffic, but none of them question that official line from the police. And I just think it's a good example of how superficial the coverage is in a lot of cases from the media. So I missed a slide. But anyway, there's a few key mistakes that people are making when they're covering these cases. They're calling crashes accidents. That's a big no-no we talk about all the time in the advocacy world, because it sort of implies that these are blameless incidents and nothing could be done to prevent them. And that's sort of an obstacle to taking the steps we need to help people avoid this terrible thing that's happening to 13 people a day across the country. Another thing, mentioning the clothing. Again, if a woman was raped, for example, you know, we would know now it's not appropriate to say, but she was wearing a short skirt, you know, and so I think that we need to have a little bit of a heightened sensitivity in our culture when we're talking about these incidents. And we're sort of not there yet. So that's another mistake they're making. A lot of times the media coverage blames the vehicle rather than the driver. So someone was hit by a car, you know, and it sort of, again, distances the driver from the incident and sort of redirects blame for these kind of cases. So my sort of advice for everyone who's an advocate, for people in government is, you know, if you are in government, it's helpful to avoid these to sort of recognize some of these larger cultural biases, how they can contribute to this kind of violence, and to try to avoid them in your own work. And if you're working with the police department, even better, because they're a really important authority on this issue. But also, as advocates, we can be reaching out to the media and helping educate them. Like I said, I don't think a lot of this media coverage is malicious. It's just a lot of people just haven't been, they're caught up in sort of the old narrative, and they need to be sort of better educated. We need to have more cultural sensitivity. And I think that advocates can help by reaching out to journalists when they see them making some of these mistakes and blaming the victims, even before there's been a full investigation. So what I recommend for those folks is reaching out to the people directly. Usually when a reporter does a story, they'll be contact information right there. Reporters are used to being contacted for corrections, for whatever, and you can just politely say, look, the way you frame this is problematic, and here's why. And this is something I think is a really good resource for you. Like I said, there's becoming more and more awareness about this on the part of the media, but we still haven't really quite broken through. But the Columbia Journalism Review did a really great article where they run through all the mistakes and how they can be problematic. And this is it right here. You can find it on Google, or perhaps America Walks will include it in their recap, so that you'll have it. But this is a good resource you can send them and say, this is a respected industry publication, and here's why some of what you're doing can be a problem. And you can help educate the media people in your community so they're not sort of contributing to the problem with the way they frame things. And that's it from me.
Okay, great. Thank you. And an important thing that I think all of us can be doing and be doing more of is this vigilant kind of fact checking and keeping our media on their toes and making sure that they're being careful in the reporting of these issues. We're gonna turn on everyone's microphones. One question that I've gotten in multiple forms, so I'm gonna opt to do that, is if you could have people on this call do one thing, make one change, call one person, talk about something, do something, what would it be? Topher.
Ask for clear data around the pedestrian crashes and then pedestrian citations in your own community. If you're interested in seeing if there's a problem with how they're enforcing pedestrian statutes in your community, ask for transparency and clarity around the data and that it be recurring.
Great. Andrew.
It would be to hold focus groups where you pay community participants in addition to any public meetings that you do.
Angie.
Yeah, I think it's important to be framing your own discussions about this carefully and sensitively, and also to be working with the folks who are doing the professional reporting and framing as well.
Great. Thank you for your great presentations and sharing your knowledge with all of us today. For the people on the call, if you haven't looked into Topher or Angie's work on ProPublica and Streets Blog, I encourage you to do so. And Andrew, I understand you'll be at Walk Bike Places in New Orleans. You want to make mention?
Yes, I wanted to make a plug. We'll be at Walk Bike Places at 3 o'clock on Monday. We are going to be doing a panel conversation, which is going to have different members of our advisory group participating in a panel discussion about the Just Spaces project. I think it's going to be a really great and lively discussion, and hope you can make it 3 to 4 in the Oak Alley room if you are at Walk Bike Places.
Okay, thank you. I want to give one more thanks to all of our sponsors who support America Walks for this webinar program and all of our programming. We couldn't do it without them and with all the support of everyone who attends and just supports our work in general, so thank you. And I want to make sure that you mark your calendars for our next webinar, which is on October 10th. We will be looking at what issues and thoughts and ideas to keep in mind as we look at campaigns and candidates come the election season. So we will be looking at walk in action, walking and walkability policy issues. And again, that's at October 10th, and the registration link will be in your email that you received with the webinar recording. With that, I will say good afternoon and have a great rest of the day. And thank you again for joining us.